Hey guys, it's Shaylin, and I'm here today with another episode of Recent Reads. This is the series where I just chat about the last 10 books that I read. So I'm going to talk about books I read from sometime in October or November until almost the end of the year, late December. I've been meaning to include a little disclaimer like this at the start of my recent reads, and I keep forgetting. This is obviously extremely subjective. Ultimately, I don't believe that the point of literature is to create a book that any one individual will enjoy. Every single one of these books that I talk about has value, and no matter how much I liked or disliked them, and no matter what rating I give them, they brought value to the world and also to my life. Even books that I don't enjoy as much, I feel bring value to me as a person. And so I just want to be clear that when I give books a star rating, that is a measure of my subjective experience in terms of how much I enjoyed reading it. But it's not a value judgment on the value of the work and what it brings to the world and what it brings to literature, because I think that can't be quantified and shouldn't be quantified, and it's not the point of books, right? The point of books isn't to appeal to any individual. And so when I'm coming on here and I'm like, this is what I liked and didn't like about these books, that's not meant to rate the book's value. It's just a rating and assessment of my personal experience reading it. The first book that I read was With Teeth by Kristin Arnett. So I read this for a book club that I'm in with some coworkers. So this book follows a woman named Sammy and her kind of struggling relationship with her wife Monica, as well as her difficulties with her son Samson, who she can't seem to really connect with. I have weird feelings about this book. I enjoyed this, but I also didn't. Nothing happened, but I was also kind of captivated. It was very normal and very weird all at once. This is a book about a very manipulative, unreliable character who makes a lot of very bad decisions. And if you don't like those kinds of characters, you will probably hate this book, but I really do enjoy those kinds of characters. The impact of the book didn't really hit me until the final 3 pages, because that's when the true nature of the character really struck me after being on this kind of chaotic, messy journey with this character the whole time. It's hard to say. This is a really hard book to quantify. I gave it a 3.5 in my notes, and I don't really know what that number means. This is a wild ride. I see how it could be really polarizing. I did take down one quote from my book club's meeting I thought was so funny, which was, my ultimate takeaway from this book is everyone needs therapy. So then I read Love After the End, an anthology edited by Joshua Whitehead. This is an anthology of two-spirit and indigiqueer speculative fiction. Basically, this book is all speculative stories, specifically science fiction, so they all take place in futuristic or somehow dystopian worlds or concepts or settings, but they're all told from a queer indigenous perspective. Overall, this is a very well curated collection, and every story is very well written. I did think there were some odd structural choices made in terms of how the anthology was organized, because there were several points where stories with very similar concepts were put back to back. It was 2 stories about terraforming a new planet back to back, 2 stories about AI back to back. And in retrospect, that made it really hard for me to parse the difference between those 2 stories in my mind. They blur together, and I'm like, oh, the AI story, oh no, wait, that was 2 stories, but they were back to back. So there were just some weird structural choices that I'm not sure why, in the overall organization of the anthology, that I'm not really sure why they were made. And obviously, any anthology, there are going to be stories that you enjoy more or enjoy less. That's the nature of reading a collection, especially in this case where it's an anthology, so it's written by all different authors. There's a very high consistency of quality in the writing. Sometimes when you read anthologies, there are a few stories when you're like, oh, this person is an amazing writer, and then there are some that are kind of the writing is just not as punchy, but the consistency of quality across all the stories is very high. And so I think that probably every reader will just have different stories that really stand out to them and that they really love and that really resonate with them. But it's definitely a good collection. I would definitely recommend it. I didn't get from the marketing that this is a bit more YA, which is totally fine. I just wasn't really expecting that, and I'm not normally a YA reader. So then I read Magma by Thora Hjörleifsdóttir. This is a sparse little novella set in Reykjavik about this 20-year-old girl. This increasingly like toxic, abusive relationship and situation that she finds herself in with kind of her first boyfriend. Overall, I thought that the writing, form, and details chosen here were extremely effective. It's an extremely fluid read. It's told in very brief vignettes, and each vignette kind of hones in on a particular aspect of their relationship very poignantly. Kind of rather than seeing all the threads evolve together, it's like you just get this really, really precise look at a different aspect of the relationship. This book very carefully maintains a light touch. Like the main character's pain is shown very effectively and often through more so what isn't said than what is said. My only real note, I guess, is just that there were a few things that felt a little too on the nose. Especially because throughout so much of the book, there was so much restraint in letting the subtext breathe and not overtly saying what could be felt. Especially because the book otherwise had such a light touch, I think it did stand out more when there were moments or statements that felt a little too on the nose. But I read this in one sitting. I thought it was very effective. So we have some poems. Pilgrim Bell by Kaveh Akbar. Huge Kaveh Akbar fan here. His other collection, Calling a Wolf a Wolf, is Chef's Kiss. Incredible, one of my favorites. And he really does deliver with this one. This collection is so wise, yet so tender. So humble, yet so eye-opening. I think he's a poet of really, really fantastic insight, but he presents this insight and this truth with this sense of humbleness, and it's really beautiful, it's really touching, and I think it makes the poems more powerful. Despite his very wise poetic voice, he also understands like the limits of himself as a human and only knowing what he can know, and yet he's also able to use that limited perspective of just being a person to talk about really broad, grand ideas about religion and God, and it's like this contrast between the smallness of a person and the grandness of idea and faith and the world. So then I read Happy Hour by Marlowe, Granados. So this book follows Isla, I think she's 19 or 20-year-old girl who moves to New York City with her best friend. And I saw a review of this book that described the two of them as they're low on cash but rich in charm. It's Isla's diary, and it's kind of just the two of them trying to live the kind of lavish, glamorous New York artsy party girl lifestyle of their dreams, while kind of also getting by with barely anything. I found that this was full of the wise, insightful truths that young people have without realizing how insightful they are. I found Isla to be a really refreshing protagonist. In many ways, she's coming into her own power, starting to realize the influence that she can have over people, and she's ready to use that power, but her goal is kind of just to have fun. She's very savvy and she kind of is ready to use people, but never in a malicious way. It's difficult to say what in general makes a story worth telling, but I would say that a lot of the time a story is worth telling because there's something special about the protagonist that makes them unique, yet in their uniqueness, they can speak to the grander themes and feelings of being a person. Oh, Issa. Her name's Issa, not Isla. Sorry, I just looked at my notes and her name's actually Issa. Oops, okay. And Issa definitely, it's been a while since I read this book. Issa definitely has that. She's kind of aware that there's something special about her, and she knows that it benefits her, but she's not exactly sure the extent of how far she can push that or exactly what it is yet. What I wrote in my notes was, she is not like other people, but the beauty of it is that she is exactly like other people. So, I don't know, I just found this very sharp, a lot of wry observations about life and youth and love. It got a little tired as it went on because a lot of scenes and moments do start to feel repetitive of each other. Overall, it's a very low-stakes story with very meandering plot. And I think the appeal and the success of the book is going to depend on how much you personally connect to the protagonist. I personally did, so I really enjoyed the book. And I think that that will be the deciding factor. So then I read Tower by Bae Myung-hoon. This is a brilliant little interconnected short story collection. All of the stories take place in Tower, which is a 674-story skyscraper that is its own sovereign nation. It's a fascinating world a brilliant concept. There's a deep amount of lore, and the lore is so fascinating too. My two favorite stories were the first one, which is about a bunch of researchers who are trying to track the power structures of Tower. They discover that a major power broker of the nation is a dog. My other favorite story was about this woman whose ex crashes in the desert. I found the concepts, the world, the lore fascinating. I didn't think the characters were particularly deep. I think the characters in this collection serve more to play a role in the world, to explore the structures of the world, rather than it being about their personal journeys. But this is one of the coolest books I've read, and my main question is, when is Bong Joon-ho adapting it to film? This is just vertical Snowpiercer. So then I read Red Pill by Hari Kunzru. I don't even know how to explain to you what this book is about. There's this guy. He's a writer. He goes to this writing residency in Berlin. The vibes are weird. He's obsessed with this police procedural show and its creator, even though he hates the show and everything it stands for. And he wanders around, and it's very cerebral and existential. This is a super cerebral, contemplative, philosophical book, I would say. But it's also very much about the narrator's internal breakdown and crisis mood. It does take a while for there to be a sense of drive or cohesion. For a long time, the book is very much just guy thinks thoughts in Berlin. But I think that as the scope of the book narrows to a specific trajectory for this character, it really does highlight what is so compelling about the narrator, and the narrative and the main character becomes extremely fascinating. And as there became a more defined scope and trajectory, it also really highlighted the strength of the writing and the weirdness of the world, the perceptiveness of the writing, and this overall hazy, surreal quality to the storytelling. It's very floaty and muddled. At the start, I didn't think I was enjoying it, and by the end, I actually really appreciated this novel. So then I read Shiner by Amy Jo Burns. I picked this book up because it reminded me of the novel that I'm writing a scary amount. There were weird similarities, and so I was I need to read this. So this book follows a teenage girl named Ren who lives in the Appalachian Mountains with her parents, and she doesn't go to school or anything, and her dad trains snakes, claims to be basically a divine man that the community looks to as a blessed godly figure. I really loved the writing, the sense of place, the detail choice. It was extremely sensory. It really made use of the natural world and was able to describe the natural world in very, I think, original, tactile ways. I felt that the structure of this book didn't really give much room for the characters to develop. We open on Ren and her journey, but the book is split into sections, and different sections follow different characters, and so it felt there wasn't really space for her to have a journey. As soon as she began to have her journey, it was cut off, and there just wasn't really space for her to develop as a character. So as a result, the characters didn't feel super fleshed out to me because the structure wasn't allowing them to breathe really on the page, and so the story lost its grip for me more and more as it went on. As a concept, it's great fun. There's a really compelling world and events, and some great writing. The structure just really got in the way of the characters for me. Wasn't a huge fan of the structural choice to basically begin with Ren's story and then cut back and spend most of the middle of the book in flashback with other characters and then come back to her right at the end, because it never really gave space or time for any one character's arc to actually develop. So then I read Trust Exercise by Susan Choi, which I also read for the book club that I'm in with some coworkers. We open on two characters in a performing arts school and this kind of intense relationship that they have. So I really enjoyed the first 100 pages, the first section of this book, where we're following this main character, Sarah, and the students around her. Even though I was not a theater kid, I knew a lot of theater kids in high school, because I did stage managing. I'm not an actor. I've always been surrounded by theater kids, so I felt this book really did capture their energy and how ungodly they can be. I think this book lives and dies by the tailspin after the first section, and how much you enjoy the book is going to be based on how impactful you find that tailspin. But it's very hard to talk about this book because I think that the main qualities that really make it, you can't really talk about without spoiling it. Personally, I kind of do like what that shift was doing in theory, but I felt that after it, the story lost a lot of momentum. It became very hazy and twisty in a way that I think was meant to get us to question the reliability of the narrative, but I was already questioning that. Like, I already didn't feel that this was a reliable narrative. This book kind of gets into this pattern of getting you on board with what's happening and then upending it, and I can't decide how much I liked those shifts or not. I think some people will hate this, some people will love this. I was kind of in the middle. For me, those twists did kind of actually, at times, muddy what was being said about the characters and theme rather than enhancing them, like I think would be the purpose. But I also did kind of like them in theory, and there were aspects of them I enjoyed. Anyways, I can't really talk about this book more without spoiling it. It's definitely a divisive one. So the last book that I read was Acts of Desperation by Megan Nolan. It follows an unnamed narrator who falls in love with this man named Kieran and eventually ends up in a relationship with him. One day he suddenly ends their relationship and she just kind of totally spirals. I found that this had just too much telling for me to really get the full impact of the character. And as a result, it felt melodramatic at a lot of points. There are definitely some striking, truthful moments in the book, for sure. But to me, those always felt like the subtler moment. It's not that the events feel overblown or unreasonable, because I think that this is a very realistic narrative that could happen and probably has happened before. It's just that the shocking aspects of the book didn't really feel earned by a developed character or relationship. Rather, it felt like the shocking bits were trying to develop the main character and the relationship. As a main character, we only really saw her issues developing, not her developing, like, as a person. So while it feels like the depiction of some of the topics in this book, like self-harm and abusive relationships and eating disorders, were quite realistic, actually, and actually quite sensitive and tasteful, it didn't really feel like there was a character underneath. So I think that a great example of this is actually even in her attraction to Kieran. She, on the first page, is just inexplicably attracted to him the instant she sees him. There's no real reason or development or backing to that attraction. It's just there. That kind of feels like a recurring theme throughout this book, that things are just the way they are, but there isn't really a character supporting it. This is making it seem like I really didn't like this book, and it's not that. I actually read it pretty quickly. Like I said, there are some really striking moments, and I think a lot of individual sections work really well as standalone pieces. But it didn't feel like there was a character underneath. I think that, like, I can't help but compare this book to Magma, and I just feel like it was a similar form and a similar narrative, but Magma was able to get to the heart of the character, to reveal her pain because we knew her as a person, whereas in this book, it felt like we only knew her pain, but we didn't know her as a person. So those are my thoughts on the last 10 books that I read. As always, let me know what you've been reading. I think my main actual question for this video would be, what was your favorite read from 2021? My favorite read of 2021 was Winter in Sokcho by Elisa Schwa Dusapin. I love that book. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video.